The wind carried ice off the high peaks that morning, slicing down the valley and across the wide open plain like it bore some cruel message for anyone left out in it. She felt it bite through the seams of her worn coat, down to where her hands clutched at the curve of her belly, rounding fuller by the week. Snow had not started falling yet, but the sky was heavy with it, the kind of gray that pressed close and low, ready to break. She had walked since dawn, boots soaked through from the last creek she'd crossed, and her breath came harder now, shallower. Somewhere behind her, days behind, she prayed, was the man she was running from, a man who had once sworn to love her but had taught her instead what fear tasted like when it lodged in your ribs and refused to leave. She didn't look back anymore. There was nothing back there but memory and blood. Up ahead, tucked near a line of wind-stunted pines, was a house. Smoke trailed from its chimney in a thin, steady line. She paused on the rise, one hand on her side. Her legs trembled. The thought of knocking, of asking, of trusting a stranger again, it was almost enough to turn her back into the open. Almost. But the child kicked then, a faint flutter beneath her ribs like the wings of a bird not yet hatched, and she started forward once more. The house was plain, square, built of dark logs. The yard was fenced with rails that leaned here and there, and a single horse watched her from the small paddock, tail swishing, breath fogging in the cold. She stepped up to the door, raised her fist. Her knuckles hesitated just an inch from the rough-hewn wood. Inside, she could hear the low crackle of fire. Somewhere a kettle whistled soft and steady. She knocked. The door opened quicker than she expected. The man who stood there looked to be carved out of the same earth as the house, broad-shouldered, rough-bearded, his shirt open at the throat. His eyes were the color of late autumn smoke, not unkind but wary. He looked past her first, then down at her belly, then back up to her face. She opened her mouth. No words came. He stepped aside without speaking and motioned her in with a tilt of his head. She walked in slow, dragging the cold with her. Inside smelled of pine and coffee and something faintly sweet, like baked apples. A fire snapped in the stone hearth. There was only one chair by it. The rest of the space was sparse, but clean tools hung on the wall, a rifle rested in the corner, and a worn quilt lay folded on a cot beneath the small window. He closed the door behind her. "Name's Elias," he said after a moment. His voice was low, more gravel than thunder. "You look like you need sitting more than talking. Take the chair." She did, sinking into it with a grateful breath. Her bones ached. Her hands felt like they didn't belong to her anymore. He poured water from the kettle into a tin mug and passed it to her. Steam curled up, warming her face. She didn't drink right away, just held it, letting the heat seep into her fingers. "I don't mean harm," she said finally, voice brittle from cold and disuse. "Didn't figure you did," Elias said, not unkindly. "You got a name." She hesitated. "Lena." He nodded once, and that was enough. They sat in silence, the fire filling the space between them. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Elias busied himself with something near the stove, bread maybe or stew, and she watched him through the steam, not knowing yet if this was safety or just the next stop in a long road of survival. But for the moment, it was warm. She was off her feet. And for the first time in weeks, no one was shouting, no fists were raised, and the child inside her moved not in fear, but as if it too sensed the quiet. She watched the snow gather on the windowsill and let herself believe, just a little, in the idea that something new might begin here. Even if it was just a breath's worth of peace, the snow didn't stop. By nightfall it had deepened into the kind that smothered sound, blanketed the woods, and buried trails without trace. It came down heavy and thick, cloaking the world in hush. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and steady, and Lena felt it in her bones like a benediction. Elias moved without speaking much. He was not a man who filled silence for comfort. When he set a bowl in front of her, thick stew with bits of salt pork and carrot, he simply nodded once as if to say eat, and she did. Hunger was an old ache, familiar and quiet, but she hadn't had meat in weeks, and the warmth of it filled her in a way she hadn't expected. It made her eyes burn. He noticed but said nothing. Later he pulled a blanket from a cedar chest and set up a cot near the fire. "The one by the window," he said, "got too cold at night." She didn't argue. Her legs barely carried her that far before she sank down, drawing the blanket up over her knees. "Storm'll keep us in a day or two," Elias said as he banked the fire. "You're welcome to wait it out." "Thank you," she said, because there wasn't anything else to say that didn't feel too big for the space they shared. He slept on the floor across the room, not near enough to make her flinch, not far enough to seem unkind. She heard him breathing in the dark, slow and steady, a presence that asked nothing of her. And for the first time in too long, she slept without fear nipping at the edges of her dreams. Morning came gray and slow. The snow had stopped, leaving the cabin roof thick with white and the woods dripping in silence. Lena woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of kindling catching. Elias was at the hearth again, coaxing flame. He glanced over once but didn't speak. She sat up, rubbing her face. "Let me help," she said, before she could talk herself out of it. He looked her over, not like a man measuring what she was worth, but like one who understood what offering meant. He nodded. "There's a churn by the wall. Bread needs butter." So she worked the churn while he split wood outside. Her arms ached from it, but it felt good. Real, not just surviving, but doing. By midday, the place smelled of yeast and wood smoke. Elias said little, but when he passed by he left half a pear on the table beside her, dried and soft from storage. It felt like an offering. The next day, the road vanished under white. The world shrank to the cabin walls and the sound of wind between trees. Lena mended a tear in her dress with thread she found in a tin, and Elias sanded down the haft of a tool by the hearth. It was a strange rhythm, but not an unkind one. That evening, as the sky turned violet beyond the glass, she spoke again. "You live alone out here." Elias didn't look up, for a long while now. "Why?" He shrugged. Sometimes quiet's easier than noise. She knew what that meant, knew the shape of grief when someone didn't want to give it words. She didn't press. "You." She could have lied, but her voice was tired of hiding. "My husband died," she said. That part was true in its own way. The man after him, he wasn't kind. Elias' jaw shifted, but he didn't interrupt. "I left before he could hurt the child too." Silence stretched out, but it didn't feel like judgment, just room for the truth to breathe. "You were right to go," he said at last. They didn't speak of it again that night, but something shifted in the hush between them, something steady and cautious. Like a hand offered palm up, not grabbing, not demanding. Snow fell again as they slept. And in the quiet dark, with the fire crackling low and the child moving gently within her, Lena thought for the first time that maybe she could stay. Not forever, but long enough to remember who she'd once been, long enough to decide what kind of mother she wanted to become. By the time the snow melted enough to show the path again, Lena had been at the cabin near a fortnight. Time slipped differently in the hush of the woods, days stitched together by small tasks, long silences, and the quiet rhythm of two people who had learned how to live without asking too much of the world or each other. In the mornings, Elias rose early to chop wood. She would hear him outside, axe ringing against the block, each strike measured and sure. Sometimes she watched from the window, steam curling from her coffee, one hand over the gentle roll of her belly. She liked the steadiness of him, not just his work, but the way he never looked at her like she was broken. Her strength came back slow, not just in body, but in ways she hadn't expected. She found herself humming sometimes, soft and low, while stirring stew or folding her things. The sound surprised her. It had been years since her voice had left her mouth without needing to explain or defend. One afternoon, after a thaw had softened the trail, Elias saddled his horse. "Need to go into town," he said. "Feed, lamp oil, be gone a day." She stood on the porch, arms folded against the wind. The idea of him leaving sat crooked in her gut. "I'll be fine," she said. He nodded, as if he'd never doubted it. He came back the next evening, coat dusted with mud, cheeks ruddy from cold. He brought back salt, coffee, and without a word, 3 yards of blue calico. He set it on the table and didn't say a thing, just turned to put up his saddle gear. Lena touched the cloth with both hands. It was finer than anything she owned. The kind of thing a woman might make something pretty out of, not just useful, not just for getting by. She sewed the next few days. The needle felt strange in her fingers, but the work quieted her thoughts. By the time she finished, she'd made a loose tunic, something to fit her changing shape, something soft to sleep in. When she wore it, she felt less like a ghost. The snow kept melting. Icicles dropped from the eaves like chimes, and birds returned to the trees in 2s and 3s. With spring came chores, repairing the paddock fence, clearing the brush where the garden would be. Lena took to sitting near the edge of the yard in the afternoon sun, watching Elias work, her hands folded over her belly, her thoughts quieter than they'd been in years. Then one night, a rider came. It was near dusk. The fire had just been lit, and they'd not yet eaten. The sound of hooves came first, sharp, quick, urgent, and Elias moved faster than she'd seen him move, rifle in hand, before the stranger even crested the ridge. Lena's breath caught. She stood, heart hammering, fingers clenched tight in her skirt. But the rider was just a boy, barely 16. His face was flushed from cold and fear. "There's a woman hurt," he panted. "Out by Dawson Creek, wagon tipped, she's bleeding bad." Elias didn't hesitate. "Get inside. Stay warm," he told Lena, already swinging the saddle down. "I'm coming," she said, voice firmer than she expected. He paused, looked at her like he wanted to argue. "She might need more than one pair of hands," she added. He gave a single nod. The ride was rough, mud thick, air sharp, but they found the wagon near the bend in the creek. One wheel snapped clean through, and a woman moaning in the back, her leg caught beneath a fallen beam. Elias lifted it while Lena climbed in. The woman's face was pale, lips blue at the edges, but her eyes opened when Lena touched her. "It's all right," Lena said, voice steady. "We've got you now." It took all they had to get her free and back to the cabin. Elias cleared the cot by the fire, and Lena worked through the night, cleaning the wound, stitching where she could, whispering soft words when the woman cried out. By dawn, the bleeding had stopped. The woman slept, breath ragged but even. Elias poured coffee and handed a mug to Lena. She was too tired to lift it. "You didn't have to come," he said quietly. "I did," she said. "I needed to remember I could still do something good." He didn't answer, but she saw it in his eyes, that recognition, that quiet understanding. Outside, spring was coming. Inside, something else had begun to grow. Not love, not yet, but trust maybe. The kind that doesn't ask, doesn't rush. The kind that plants roots slow and deep, waiting for sun. The woman they saved, her name was Hester, stayed with them through the thaw. Her leg mended slow, stiff and aching in the damp mornings, but she was sharp-willed and strong despite it. The kind of woman who kept her jaw set even when pain curled up her spine. Lena helped her dress the wound each day, and in return Hester taught her how to grind willow bark for fever and how to stitch a proper saddlebag from an old coat. They sat together by the fire in the evenings, hands busy, voices quiet. There was a kind of comfort in it, woman to woman, neither needing to pry. Lena learned that Hester had once run freight with her brother, west of the Snake River, and that she hadn't seen him in 2 years, not since he left with a wagon train bound for California. "You think he's alive?" Lena asked one night, the wind muttering against the shuttered windows. Hester had shrugged. "Don't much like gambling on hope, but I leave a candle in the window when I move on, just in case." Lena carried that with her, the image of a lone light burning against dark. As the land softened and green threaded through the brown, Lena's belly grew heavier. The child shifted more now, strong and sure. Some nights she lay awake with one hand resting there, feeling it move like tides beneath her skin. It frightened her, how real it was becoming, how near, but it steadied her too. This was not just something she carried. It was someone who needed her to believe in more than running. Elias watched her with a kind of quiet that never pressed. He carved things sometimes, small animals from pine, fox, elk, even a sparrow with wings outstretched, and left them near the hearth, never saying a word about it. She began to place them on the shelf by the window, one by one, until it looked like a procession of wild things had gathered to watch the snow melt. One afternoon, after checking Hester's stitches and washing the linens in cold creek water, Lena stood behind the cabin, staring up at the rise where the trees gave way to sky. The breeze carried the smell of pine sap and damp earth. She heard the gate creak and turned to see Elias watching her. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked. He didn't answer at once, just looked out at the trees, the sky above them turning slowly gold. "I did once," he said, "before this place, before everything quieted down inside me." "What stopped you?" He glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something vulnerable in his face, like a wound long since closed but still tender to touch. "Figured I'd already lost enough, didn't want to lose the peace too." She nodded, she understood that better than she ever had before. That night, after Hester had gone to sleep and the fire had burned down to coals, Lena sat with Elias at the table, candlelight flickering between them. "I'm scared," she said, almost too soft to hear. He didn't ask why, didn't try to fix it, just reached across and laid his hand gently over hers, the touch warm, steady. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. Her throat closed, she couldn't speak, but she didn't pull her hand away. And in the hush of the cabin, with spring rising all around them, she let herself believe, for the first time, that maybe staying wasn't the same as being trapped. Maybe it could be choosing. Maybe it could be beginning. The rains came late that spring, long, silver sheets that soaked the earth and turned the creek wild. It roared past the cabin day and night, high and swift with meltwater, and everything smelled of wet bark and moss. Birds nested in the eaves, and the garden Elias had started, rows of peas and potatoes, early lettuce, began to push through the mud in fragile green shoots. Hester left on a dry morning. Her leg was stronger now, stiff but serviceable. Elias saddled a horse for her, and Lena packed a small satchel with food, herbs, and one of the carved sparrows. "You ever head south," Hester said, adjusting the blanket tied behind her saddle, "look for a place called Stonetree Hollow. My cousin keeps a room there for travelers. Tell him I sent you." Lena hugged her longer than she meant to. There was something fierce and kind in the woman's strength, like a warning and a blessing wrapped together. "Don't stop leaving candles," Lena whispered. Hester smiled, crooked and tired, only way to be found. And then she rode off, her silhouette shrinking against the green hills until it vanished into trees. The days that followed grew warmer. Elias worked longer hours outside, patching the roof, clearing more ground for planting. Lena took to the porch with her sewing or a book when the sun was high, her feet propped on a stool, the child pressing hard now beneath her ribs, a weight she carried with more patience than fear. Some nights when the creek quieted, they sat together under the stars. No need for words. Sometimes he'd hand her a tin mug of tea, sometimes he'd point to a distant constellation, speaking its name low and reverent, as if the sky had taught him its own language. One evening, the quiet broke. Lena was in the garden, kneeling in soft dirt, when Elias' horse whinnied, a sharp, unsettled sound. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, heart tightening without reason. He came around the side of the cabin fast, rifle slung low. His face was carved from stone. "There's someone on the ridge," he said. She didn't ask how he knew, he just did. He told her to stay inside. She obeyed. The air outside changed, heavier, electric. She paced the cabin floor, each creak of board like thunder. Her hands trembled against the window glass. Then came voices. 2, maybe 3. She couldn't make out the words. She caught a glimpse, men on horseback, dark coats, wide-brimmed hats. One pointed toward the barn. Then Elias' voice, loud and calm, "You best ride on." A pause, then laughter, not friendly. She reached for the fire iron. When the door opened, she nearly struck, but it was Elias, jaw clenched tight. "They've gone," he said. Said they were looking for someone, didn't give names. She wanted to collapse. Instead, she set the iron down and sat slow. Elias poured her water with shaking hands. Could be nothing, could be they just like pushing folks. But they both knew better. The past had long arms. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot by the fire, watching the shadows shift on the ceiling. When Elias rose to check the door again, she sat up. "If they come back, they won't get past me," he said, steady. She didn't ask how he knew, she just believed him. She stood, crossed the room, and reached for his hand. He took it, not like a promise, more like an understanding. And in that shared silence, Lena made a choice, not out of fear, but from the root-deep strength that had grown in her since snow first fell. She was going to stay, not just to birth her child, not just to survive, but to make something here that couldn't be stolen, something worth protecting. She looked out the window, where the stars still burned. And somewhere inside her, something fierce and tender unfurled its wings. Summer arrived in slow, golden waves. The earth warmed and dried, and the garden thickened with green. Bees stitched lazy lines between flowers, and the days stretched long, the light holding on well into the evening. Lena moved slower now, her breath shorter, the weight of the child growing heavier with each passing hour. Her hands swelled, her back ached, but her spirit, after so many winters, stood taller than it had in years. They never saw the riders again, but Elias reinforced the shutters and made sure the barn doors bolted strong. He didn't say much about it, but each evening he'd check the rifle, then sit by the door a while before turning in. Lena would watch him from the cot, her fingers curled around her belly, grateful for the steadiness in him, like old stone or rooted trees. One night the pain began. It woke her just past midnight, a hard pull low in her belly. She sat up, the room lit only by embers. The second pain followed quick, sharp, deeper. She gasped, called for Elias. He came fast, barefoot, eyes wide but calm. He helped her stand, bracing her gently. "It's time," she said. He nodded, didn't waste breath on worry or doubt, just moved into motion the way he did with all things. He built up the fire, heated water, laid blankets on the floor. She leaned against the wall, swaying through the pain, sweat slicking her brow. The hours passed in a haze of breath and blood and firelight. When the moment came, she cried out, loud and raw. The child slipped from her in a rush of warmth and weight and sound. And then quiet. Not silence, but something deeper. Then the cry came, thin and strong. Elias wrapped the child in a towel and handed them to her with both hands, careful, reverent. A girl, tiny, red-faced, perfect. She stared up at Lena with eyes not quite open, mouth rooting for comfort. Lena wept, and this time it was not from pain. She held the child against her breast and whispered a name, one she'd carried like a stone in her heart for months, waiting for the right breath to release it. "Junia," she said, "you are mine." Elias stayed close, quiet and solid. At dawn, he brought her tea and sat nearby, carving something small and careful from pine. Days passed. The cabin grew softer with the presence of the child. Her cry, her breath, her impossible smallness. Lena ached, healing slow, but she did not retreat. She fed Junia, sang to her, held her close beneath the quilt Elias had brought out from the cedar chest. One morning, Lena stepped outside with the baby in her arms. The air smelled of hay and clover. The world was green and wide, birds looping over the meadow. Elias joined her, his sleeves rolled, hands still dusty with work. "She's got your strength," he said, voice quiet. Lena looked down at Junia, who blinked sleepily against the sun. "No," she said, "she's got her own." They stood that way a long time, three souls shaped by wind and fire and loss, and something else too, something slower, truer. Not rescue, not salvation. Recognition. Love, maybe, if you believed in such things growing like wildflowers, stubborn and bright between stones. That night, as Junia slept beside the fire, Lena placed a candle in the window, not for anyone lost, not for anyone coming. Just a light to say, here we are still standing, still choosing. Home,